The snow was falling softly in Three Rivers, Michigan, when 19-year-old Cathy Swartz kissed her baby goodnight on December 15, 1986. By morning, she was dead, beaten, stabbed, and strangled in her small apartment, while her infant daughter lay crying in the next room. The brutal murder shattered this quiet town, sending ripples of fear through every kitchen conversation and sidewalk whisper. Police collected evidence, interviewed suspects, and promised justice would come swiftly. But days became weeks, weeks became years, and Cathy's killer vanished into the shadows of time. For 37 years, her mother visited the grave, her daughter grew up without answers, and detectives carried the weight of failure. Then, in 2023, forensic genetic genealogy cracked the case wide open, revealing a name that shocked everyone: Robert Waters, a drifter who had been hiding in plain sight. But when police arrived to arrest him, they discovered the truth had come too late. What drove Waters to kill an innocent young mother, and why did it take nearly 4 decades to find him? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Late afternoon, shadows stretched across Three Rivers as the first snowflakes of December began their gentle descent. Cathy Swartz hummed softly while folding tiny clothes in her small apartment on Maple Street. At 19, she radiated the kind of warmth that made neighbors stop to chat and strangers smile back. Her baby daughter cooed from the crib, reaching chubby fingers toward the mobile spinning overhead. The phone rang. "Hey girl," came her friend Lisa's voice. "You coming to the Christmas party tomorrow?" Cathy laughed, switching the phone to her other ear. "Maybe. Depends on if this little princess cooperates." She tickled her daughter's belly, earning a delighted squeal. "You need to get out more. All you do is work and take care of that baby." "She's all I need," Cathy said, her voice tender. She meant it. Since the baby's father had left, she'd built a world around her daughter. Work at the diner, paid the bills. Evening walks through downtown kept them connected to the community. Simple pleasures filled their days. Outside, the snow fell heavier. Streetlights flickered on. Cathy pulled the curtains closed and turned on the radio. Christmas music filled the warm space as she prepared dinner. The baby fell asleep early, worn out from the day's excitement. Cathy tucked the pink blanket around her daughter's small form and whispered, "Sweet dreams, little one." She didn't notice the shadow that had been lingering outside her window, didn't see the figure watching from the darkness between the streetlights, didn't know that in a few hours, everything would change forever. The last thing she did was kiss her baby's forehead and turn off the nursery light, leaving only the glow of the hallway to chase away the darkness. Morning came gray and cold. Lisa knocked on Cathy's door at 9, coffee in one hand, donuts in the other. They'd planned to take the baby shopping for Christmas decorations, but there was no answer to her gentle rap. "Cathy?" Lisa called, pressing her ear to the door. She could hear something, a thin, desperate crying. It hung slightly ajar, the frame splintered near the deadbolt. Lisa's heart hammered as she pushed it open. The apartment was wrong, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered, dark stains on the carpet. "Cathy?" Her voice cracked. The crying grew louder, coming from the nursery. Lisa followed the sound, her hands shaking. The baby stood in her crib, face red from hours of tears, still wearing the same sleeper from the night before. But Cathy was nowhere to be found. Then, Lisa saw her. Cathy lay motionless on the bedroom floor, her body twisted in an unnatural position. Blood had pooled beneath her head. Her face was swollen beyond recognition. Lisa screamed and stumbled backward, grabbing the phone with trembling fingers. 911, "What's your emergency?" "Someone's dead. My friend is dead. There's a baby crying." "Oh God! There's so much blood." The operator's voice stayed calm and professional. "Ma'am, I'm sending officers and paramedics now. Are you safe? Is anyone else in the apartment?" Lisa clutched the baby to her chest, both of them shaking. Through the window, she could see neighbors starting to gather, drawn by her screams. Mrs. Henderson from next door pressed her face against the glass, her expression shifting from curiosity to horror. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the quiet streets of Three Rivers. The nightmare had begun. Police tape fluttered in the morning wind as Detective Mike Sullivan surveyed the scene. 20 years on the force had shown him plenty of violence. But this hit different. A young mother, a baby left orphaned, the kind of case that haunted small towns forever. The apartment told a story of struggle. Defensive wounds on Cathy's hands showed she'd fought back. The killer had used whatever was available: a kitchen knife, his fists, his hands around her throat. Multiple methods meant rage, not just robbery. This was personal. Sullivan watched the evidence team work methodically. Every drop of blood photographed, every fingerprint lifted, hair fibers collected from under her fingernails. In 1986, DNA testing was still new science, but they gathered samples anyway. You never knew when technology might catch up to justice. "Any witnesses?" asked Officer Janet Reeves. Notepad ready. Neighbor heard raised voices around midnight. Sullivan replied. But she thought it was the TV. The coroner's preliminary exam revealed the full horror: blunt force trauma to the head, multiple stab wounds, strangulation marks around her neck. Cathy had died fighting, trying to get back to her baby. Local newspaper reporter Tom Mitchell arrived as they brought out the body. The sight of the small form under the white sheet would haunt his dreams for years. He'd covered plenty of stories, but none like this. Any suspects? Mitchell asked Sullivan. Too early to say. But someone did this with a lot of anger. This wasn't random. By evening, the story led every local newscast. Young mother murdered in Three Rivers. Phone lines at the police station buzzed with tips, theories, and fears. Parents pulled their children closer. Doors that had never been locked suddenly sprouted deadbolts. The investigation was just beginning. 1 week later, bells tolled across Three Rivers as the community gathered to say goodbye. Street. Mary's church had never held so many people. They filled every pew, stood along the walls, and spilled out onto the front steps despite the bitter December cold. Cathy's mother sat in the front row, holding her granddaughter close. The baby was dressed in white, a tiny angel who would never remember her mother's voice. Family members surrounded them: aunts, uncles, cousins who'd driven from neighboring towns to pay their respects. Father McKenna spoke of a life cut short but not wasted. Cathy touched everyone she met. She had that rare gift of making people feel seen, feel valued. Her love lives on in her daughter. Friends from the diner, where Cathy worked, shared memories. She'd covered extra shifts without complaint, always remembered customers' usual orders, made the best coffee in town, small things that painted a picture of someone who cared about others. Lisa stood at the podium, tears streaming down her cheeks. She used to say that every day was a gift. Even when things were hard, even when money was tight, she'd find something to be grateful for. Usually it was that baby. She'd light up when she talked about her daughter's future. The baby fussed during the service, as if sensing the weight of sorrow around her. Cathy's mother rocked her gently and whispered, "Mama loved you. Mama loved you so much." As they lowered the casket into the frozen ground, Cathy's mother made a silent vow. Justice would come, however long it took. Whoever did this would answer for taking her daughter away. The snow began to fall again as mourners filed past the grave, each dropping a flower onto the polished wood below. Weeks stretched into months. Sullivan's notebook filled with names, alibis, and crossed-out leads. Every boyfriend Cathy had ever dated was questioned and cleared. Coworkers, neighbors, even distant relatives faced scrutiny. The evidence pointed to someone who knew her routine, someone who could get close without raising immediate alarm. DNA samples sat in the state lab, waiting their turn. Processing took months in 1987, and the results came back inconclusive. The samples were degraded, mixed with the victim's blood, difficult to separate with existing technology. "What about the ex-boyfriend?" asked Officer Reeves during one of their weekly case reviews. "Solid alibi. He was at his mother's house 3 counties over. Phone records confirm he called her twice that night. The guy from the diner who kept asking her out passed a polygraph. Plus, he was working a double shift at the factory. Time cards show he clocked out at 6 the next morning." Tips from the public started strong but faded quickly. A suspicious car seen in the neighborhood turned out to belong to a pizza delivery driver. Strange noises from the apartment above were traced to a loose shutter banging in the wind. The state police sent a specialist to review the case. He spent 3 days going through evidence and interviews. His conclusion was blunt. Without additional evidence or witnesses, this case is going to be very difficult to solve. Sullivan refused to give up. He drove past Cathy's apartment building daily, hoping something new would catch his eye. He visited her grave on the anniversary of her death. He called her mother monthly with updates that never contained real news. But as 1987 turned to 1988, the harsh reality set in. Cathy Swartz's killer was going to get away with murder. Spring thaw brought new fears to Three Rivers. With Cathy's killer still free, suspicion poisoned daily interactions. Neighbors eyed each other with fresh wariness. Friendly conversations turned guarded. The close-knit community that had rallied around the Swartz family began to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. The hardware store saw a run on deadbolts and security systems. Parents who'd once let children walk to school alone now drove them everywhere. Women traveled in pairs after dark. The simple trust that had defined small-town life withered like spring flowers in a late frost. Rumors spread like wildfire. Maybe it was someone passing through town. Maybe it was someone they all knew and trusted. Whispered theories, named names, destroyed reputations, ended friendships. Tom Mitchell, the local reporter, tried to keep coverage factual, but gossip filled the spaces between facts. At the corner cafe, conversations died when certain people walked in. Old friendships cracked under the strain of suspicion. The mailman found himself the subject of speculation, because he'd delivered Cathy's mail that day. The maintenance man who'd fixed her furnace the month before faced sideways glances. Cathy's photograph gradually faded from storefront windows. The reward fund, which had started at $5,000, grew to 10, then 15, but still no credible leads emerged. By summer, people stopped talking about it as much. Other news took over the front pages. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the shadow remained. Three Rivers was no longer the innocent place it had been before December 15, 1986. Someone among them was a killer, and that knowledge changed everything about how they saw each other and themselves. The box sat on a shelf in the basement of the county courthouse, labeled in black marker, Catherine, 2 homicide, the 15th of December 2086. Inside, carefully preserved in paper bags and plastic containers, lay the physical remnants of a life cut short. Detective Sullivan retired in 1995. His replacement, Detective Ray Torres, inherited the cold case, along with 24 others. Each represented someone's worst nightmare, but resources were limited. Active cases took priority over old mysteries. Torres pulled the Swartz file every few months, reading through witness statements and lab reports. He sent the DNA evidence for retesting when new techniques became available, but the samples remained too degraded for CODIS database comparison. The baby, now a school-age girl, lived with her grandmother. They'd moved to the other side of town, trying to build a life separate from the tragedy. But every December 15th, they visited the grave. Every birthday and Christmas carried the weight of absence. Cathy's mother aged visibly with each passing year. The case consumed her thoughts, her conversations, her hope. She called the police station monthly, asking if there were any updates. The answer was always the same: we're still working on it. New detectives were assigned to review cold cases in 1999, then again in 2003. Each brought fresh eyes but reached the same conclusion. Without new evidence or a witness, the case was unsolvable with current technology. The box remained on its shelf, patient and waiting. Inside, microscopic traces of blood and skin cells held secrets that science wasn't yet advanced enough to unlock. But technology was improving every year, bringing new possibilities to old mysteries. Somewhere out there, a killer was living free, thinking he'd gotten away with murder. Years collapsed into decades like autumn leaves blown by winter wind. Cathy's daughter grew from toddler to teenager, shaped by loss she barely understood. Her grandmother filled the gaps with stories and photographs, but pictures couldn't replace hugs or answer the questions that came with growing up. "Tell me about my mom again," became a familiar refrain in their household. The stories were warm but finite. A young woman who'd lived only 19 years, most of them before her daughter was born. The girl excelled in school, driven by a need to make her absent mother proud. Teachers knew her story, offered extra encouragement, watched for signs of struggle. She wrote essays about courage, drew pictures of angels, and kept her mother's photograph on her nightstand. At 16, she asked to visit the police station. Detective Torres, now a veteran investigator himself, sat across from her in his small office. She looked remarkably like her mother, same warm eyes, same gentle smile. "Is anyone still working on her case?" she asked. "We review it regularly. Technology keeps improving. DNA testing is much better now than it was in 1986. Do you think you'll ever find who did it?" Torres chose his words carefully. "I believe the truth has a way of coming to light. It might take time, but I haven't given up hope." She left his office with mixed feelings. Hope was painful when it lived alongside doubt for so long, but giving up felt like abandoning her mother all over again. Cathy's mother developed arthritis that made visits to the grave more difficult, but she never missed the anniversary. December 15th was sacred, a day to remember and to pray for justice that seemed increasingly unlikely. The conference room at the Three Rivers Police Department felt cramped, as Detective Sarah Chen spread files across the table. The year was 2022, and she was the 5th detective assigned to Cathy's case. But Chen brought something new: training in forensic genetic genealogy, the breakthrough science that had solved dozens of cold cases across the country. "The DNA sample from 1986 is degraded but still viable," she explained to Chief Martinez. "We can build a genetic profile and upload it to public databases. If the perpetrator has relatives who've done genealogy testing, we might get a hit." Chief Martinez leaned back in his chair. 36 years was a long time to wait for justice. The community had moved on, but the Swartz family deserved answers. "What do you need?" "Permission to work with a genetic genealogy company, and patience. This process can take months." The evidence box made its familiar journey from storage to the lab. This time, the samples would be processed using technology that hadn't existed when they were collected. Single nucleotide polymorphisms could be extracted from degraded DNA, creating profiles suitable for familial searching. Chen partnered with a forensic genealogist named Dr. Lisa Hampton, who specialized in cold cases. Hampton worked from her home office in Colorado, building family trees from genetic fragments and public records. Every criminal has relatives, Hampton explained during their first video call, and millions of people have uploaded DNA to ancestry sites. If we can find a third or fourth cousin, we can work backward to identify potential suspects. The process began with uploading the crime scene DNA profile to GEDmatch, a database used by genetic genealogists. Within days, distant matches began appearing. The real work was just beginning. Dr. Hampton's computer screen filled with branching lines, connecting names across generations. Each genetic match represented a potential pathway back to the unknown killer. The closest match was a third cousin, enough genetic material shared to be significant, but distant enough to require extensive genealogical research. "I'm building trees for every match," Hampton explained during their weekly update call. Looking for common ancestors, geographical clusters, age ranges that fit your timeline. Chen found herself fascinated by the process. Traditional detective work focused on evidence and witnesses. This was archaeology, digging through decades of family history to find connections that might not be obvious. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March. Hampton had been working on a cluster of matches that all traced back to a family in southern Michigan in the 1800s. Following the branches forward through time, she identified a living descendant who might be close enough to the perpetrator to matter. "I need you to run background checks on every male in this family tree who would have been between 20 and 40 years old in 1986, Hampton said, sending over a list of 6 names. Chen's pulse quickened as she read through the list. One name jumped out: Robert Waters. Born in 1955, he would have been 31 inches, 1986. More importantly, his last known address was in Kalamazoo, less than 50 miles from Three Rivers. Chen ran Waters through every database available. No major criminal record, but several arrests for disturbing the peace and public intoxication. He'd worked construction jobs throughout Michigan in the 1,980 Then, sometime in the early 1,990 he'd moved south. His last known address was in South Carolina, where he'd been living under the radar for 3 decades. Chen's hands trembled as she dialed Hampton's number. "I think we found him." Robert Waters had lived like smoke, drifting from job to job, state to state, leaving minimal traces. But Chen was methodical, following every thread. Employment records from the 1,980 showed Waters working construction in Michigan, including a job in Three Rivers just 2 months before Cathy's murder. The pieces fit together with disturbing clarity. Waters had been in town, working on a renovation project just 3 blocks from Cathy's apartment. He would have seen her daily routine walking to work, coming home with groceries, pushing the baby stroller through downtown. Chen called the construction company, hoping someone might remember him after all these years. The foreman had long since retired, but his son remembered stories about a worker who'd caused problems. Dad said there was this guy, real odd duck, made the other workers uncomfortable, talked about women in ways that weren't right. Got fired for harassing a waitress at the lunch place they all went to. The timeline was devastating. Waters was fired on December 12, 1986. 3 days later, Cathy was murdered. Chen felt the familiar electricity of a case coming together, but finding Waters after 3 decades would be another challenge entirely. South Carolina records showed him working sporadically, never staying long in one place. His most recent address was a trailer park outside Charleston. Before making any moves, Chen needed to confirm the DNA match. She worked with the lab to compare Waters' genetic profile, reconstructed from his family tree, with the crime scene evidence. The call came on a Friday afternoon in April. "It's a match," the lab technician said. "Statistical certainty of 99.97%. Chen closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for Cathy Swartz. After 37 years, they had their killer. The warrant application was 23 pages long, detailing every step of the investigation from 1986 to 2023. Chen typed each word carefully, knowing this document would be scrutinized by defense attorneys if Waters ever made it to trial. Judge Patricia Williams read through the genetic evidence with the thoroughness that had made her a respected jurist for 15 years. The science was solid, the chain of custody intact, the statistical probability overwhelming. "This is good work, Detective Chen," Williams said, signing the warrant. 37 years is a long time to wait for justice. Chen coordinated with South Carolina authorities to make the arrest. Waters was 68 years old now, living alone in a single-wide trailer on the outskirts of Charleston. Neighbors described him as a loner who kept to himself, paid his rent in cash, and had no visitors. The plan was simple. Local officers would make the arrest, then extradite Waters back to Michigan to face murder charges. Chen booked a flight to Charleston, wanting to be there when they brought him in. On May 15, 2023, exactly 5 months after the genealogy investigation began, 2 South Carolina sheriff's deputies approached Waters' trailer. The neighborhood was quiet, Spanish moss hanging from old oak trees like funeral shrouds. Chen waited in an unmarked car, watching through binoculars as the deputies approached the front door. This was the moment she'd worked toward for months, the culmination of nearly 4 decades of investigation. The first knock echoed across the trailer park. No answer. The second knock was louder, more insistent. Still, nothing. One of the deputies circled to the back while his partner tried the door handle. It turned easily. Too easily. Chen's radio crackled to life. "Detective, you need to get over here. We've got a problem." The trailer smelled of death and stale cigarettes. Robert Waters sat in a reclining chair facing the television, a .38 revolver on the floor beside him. He'd been dead for at least 12 hours, according to the coroner's initial assessment. On the kitchen table, written in shaky handwriting on the back of an electric bill, were 4 words: "I'm sorry for everything." Chen stared at the note, feeling a complex mix of relief and frustration. Waters was their killer. The suicide seemed to confirm what the DNA had already proven. But they would never hear his confession, never understand his motive, never watch him face judgment in a courtroom. The local detective, a veteran named Morrison, shook his head grimly. Probably saw the news reports about genealogy solving cold cases. "These old killers know their time is up." Chen called Chief Martinez from outside the trailer. The conversation was brief and heavy with mixed emotions. "We got him, Chief, but he took the coward's way out." "The family needs to know," Martinez replied. "They've been waiting 37 years for this call." The drive to Cathy's mother's house felt endless. Chen had made many difficult notifications during her career, but this one carried the weight of decades. How do you tell a family that justice has finally arrived, but in the most incomplete way possible? Cathy's mother was 84 now, her granddaughter 37 older than Cathy had ever been. They sat together on the couch where they'd waited for so many phone calls over the years. Chen chose her words carefully. "We found him, the man who killed Cathy. His name was Robert Waters. He died by suicide before we could arrest him." The silence that followed contained years of pain, hope, and final acceptance. The Three Rivers Police Department hadn't held a press conference this crowded since 1986. Local reporters sat alongside representatives from state media and true crime podcasters. Chief Martinez stood at the podium, Chen beside him, both wearing their dress uniforms. "After 37 years of investigation, we can announce that the murder of Cathy Swartz has been solved through advanced DNA analysis and forensic genealogy," Martinez began. The room erupted with questions. Martinez held up his hand for quiet. The perpetrator was identified as Robert James Waters, age 68, formerly of Michigan, recently residing in South Carolina. Waters died by suicide on May 14th, one day before officers arrived to arrest him. Chen stepped to the microphone to explain the genealogy process. She kept the language simple, knowing the public needed to understand how science had finally caught up to justice. The DNA evidence collected in 1986 was compared to genetic profiles in public databases. This led us to build family trees that ultimately identified Waters as the source of the crime scene DNA. Tom Mitchell, the same reporter who'd covered the original murder, raised his hand. His hair was gray now, his face lined with years, but his voice was steady. "What can you tell us about Waters' connection to the victim?" Waters was working construction in Three Rivers at the time of the murder. He was terminated from his job 3 days before Cathy was killed. We believe he had observed her daily routine and targeted her specifically. The questions continued for an hour. Outside, protesters had gathered not against the police, but demanding justice for other cold cases that remained unsolved. The success with Cathy's case had awakened hope in families who'd been waiting just as long. News of the solved case spread through Three Rivers like spring rain after a long drought. By evening, flowers appeared at Cathy's grave: roses, carnations, daisies left by people who'd never forgotten her story. At the corner cafe, where speculation had once poisoned conversations, customers spoke in hushed tones about closure and justice. The hardware store owner who'd sold countless deadbolts after the murder posted a sign on his door: "Justice for Cathy." Finally, Mrs. Henderson, Cathy's former neighbor, who was now in her 80s, walked slowly to the apartment building on Maple Street. The building had been renovated multiple times, but she remembered exactly which window had belonged to the young mother and her baby. "I always wondered," she told the reporter who followed her. "For 37 years, I wondered if it was someone I knew, someone I'd talked to." The not knowing was almost worse than the knowing. At the elementary school where Cathy's daughter had once been a student, teachers used the case as a lesson about perseverance and justice. Technology could solve old mysteries. Truth had a way of surfacing, even after decades. The local florist ran out of white roses, Cathy's favorite, according to her mother. People who'd moved away from Three Rivers decades ago made special trips back to pay their respects. The case had touched everyone who'd lived through it, and the resolution brought a sense of communal healing. That evening, an impromptu vigil formed at the cemetery. Candles flickered in the darkness as residents who'd carried this burden for nearly 4 decades finally felt permission to let go of their fears. The killer was gone. The secret was revealed. The community could begin to heal. Cathy's daughter agreed to one interview, conducted by Tom Mitchell in the quiet sanctuary of her mother's old church. At 37, she carried her mother's gentle manner and warm eyes, but there was steel beneath the softness. A strength forged by growing up with questions that had no answers. "I'm relieved," she said, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "For 37 years we've wondered, was he still out there? Was he hurting other families? At least now we know he can't hurt anyone else." Mitchell asked about her memories of growing up without knowing what had happened. The not knowing was like a shadow that followed us everywhere. Every December 15th, every birthday, every Christmas, there was always this empty space where she should have been, and underneath it all was this fear that maybe we'd never know the truth. She spoke about her grandmother's unwavering determination to find justice. Grandma never gave up, even when the detectives changed, even when years went by with no news. She kept calling, kept pushing, kept believing that someday we'd have answers. The interview grew emotional when Mitchell asked about her own children, Cathy's grandchildren, who would never meet their grandmother. "I tell them stories about her, how she loved music, how she worked so hard to build a life for us, how she died protecting me. They know their grandmother was brave and kind and loved them before they were even born." When asked about forgiveness, her response was quiet but firm. "I don't think about forgiveness for him. I think about honoring her memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted me to live, by being the kind of mother she would have been if she'd had the chance." Detective Chen sat alone in the evidence room. The Swartz case file opened before her. 37 years of investigation filled multiple boxes: witness statements, crime scene photos, DNA reports, and countless hours of detective work by officers who'd carried this burden across decades. She thought about Detective Sullivan, who'd retired without seeing the case solved, about Detective Torres, who'd promised a teenage girl that truth had a way of coming to light, about all the investigators who'd stared at this evidence and wondered if justice would ever come. The final report was complete. Robert Waters had been conclusively identified as Cathy Swartz's killer through forensic genetic genealogy. His suicide had prevented a trial, but the evidence was overwhelming. The case that had haunted Three Rivers for decades was finally closed. Chen carefully placed each piece of evidence back in its proper container: the blood samples that had waited 37 years to speak their truth, the photographs that captured a scene of violence and loss, the witness statements that had provided pieces of a puzzle finally solved by science. She thought about the detectives who would come after her, who would inherit other cold cases, other families waiting for answers. The Swartz case proved that justice, while sometimes delayed, was not necessarily denied. Technology would continue advancing. Old mysteries would find new solutions. Before leaving the evidence room, Chen wrote a final note for the file. Cathy Swartz justice served through perseverance, technology, and the refusal to let the guilty escape judgment. May she rest in peace. The case file went back to its shelf, no longer a symbol of failure but a testament to persistence. Somewhere in the building, other cold cases waited their turn for science to catch up to justice. Cathy's mother moved slowly through the cemetery, her granddaughter's hand steady on her arm. The arthritis that had made these visits painful couldn't stop her from coming today, the first anniversary of the case being solved. The gravestone was covered with fresh flowers, white roses from the family, daisies from former coworkers at the diner, even wildflowers left by strangers who'd followed the case in the news. For 37 years, these visits had been marked by anguish and unanswered questions. Today felt different. "She knows," Cathy's mother whispered, kneeling carefully beside the headstone. "She knows we never stopped looking for the truth." The older woman's hands shook as she arranged the roses she'd brought. Her granddaughter knelt beside her, placing her own bouquet of purple flowers, Cathy's second favorite color after white. "I used to be so angry," the daughter said quietly. "Angry that I'd never know who killed her. Angry that he was out there living free while she was gone. Now I just feel peaceful, like we can finally let go of that burden." They sat together in comfortable silence, 3 generations connected by love and loss. Cathy's mother had carried the weight of seeking justice for nearly 4 decades. The knowledge that Waters was gone, that he could never hurt another family, lifted a burden from her shoulders that she'd almost forgotten she was carrying. A gentle breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling leaves and carrying the scent of fresh flowers. For the first time since December 1986, Cathy's mother felt truly at peace when she visited this place. "Come on, Grandma," her granddaughter said gently. "Let's go home." They walked away hand in hand, leaving the flowers to keep their vigil. The idea came from Father McKenna, the same priest who'd delivered Cathy's funeral sermon 37 years ago. Now, in his 80s, he suggested a memorial service to mark the resolution of the case and honor Cathy's memory properly. St. Mary's Church filled, once again. But this time the atmosphere was different. Instead of raw grief, there was something approaching peace. Families who'd been torn apart by suspicion sat together. Neighbors who'd eyed each other warily for decades exchanged gentle words and forgiving glances. Tom Mitchell covered the service for what would be his final story before retirement. He'd followed this case from beginning to end, watching it shape a community and define careers. Tonight, he wrote about healing instead of horror. "We gather not in mourning, but in celebration," Father McKenna said from the pulpit. "We celebrate justice finally served, truth finally revealed, and a community finally able to heal from wounds that have festered too long." Candles were distributed to every person in attendance. As the lights dimmed, hundreds of small flames flickered in the darkness. Children who'd been born long after Cathy's death held candles alongside residents who'd lived through the original trauma. Cathy's daughter stood to speak, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "My mother would have loved seeing this community come together. She believed in people, trusted in goodness, saw the best in everyone. She would want us to remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived." The candles burned throughout the service, their light filling the sanctuary. When people finally filed out into the night, many kept their candles burning until they reached their homes, carrying light into darkness. Three Rivers High School added a new unit to their criminal justice curriculum the following fall. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been teaching for 20 years, developed lessons around the Swartz case that covered forensic science, the importance of preserving evidence, and how communities heal from trauma. Students studied the evolution of DNA testing from 1986 to 2023. They learned about genetic genealogy, the ethics of using public databases for criminal investigations, and how cold cases could be solved decades after the fact. "This case shows us that science keeps advancing," Mrs. Patterson explained to her senior class. "Evidence that couldn't tell its story in 1986 finally spoke in 2023. It teaches us never to give up on justice." The school library created a display case featuring newspaper clippings from the case, from the initial murder through the final resolution. A photograph of Cathy smiling and holding her baby served as the centerpiece, surrounded by articles chronicling the long journey to justice. Students interviewed community members who'd lived through the original case. Mrs. Henderson, now 85, spoke about how fear had changed the way people interacted. Former police officers discussed the frustration of working with limited technology. Detective Chen visited the school to explain how genetic genealogy worked. One student, inspired by the case study, decided to pursue forensic science in college. Another chose criminal justice. A third became interested in genetic counseling. Cathy's story, which had begun in tragedy, was now inspiring a new generation to seek truth and serve justice. The hallway display included a quote from Cathy's daughter. "Every solved case gives hope to families still waiting for answers." Below it, students left flowers that were replaced weekly, ensuring fresh blooms always honored Cathy's memory. Evening settled over Three Rivers with a peace the town hadn't felt in 37 years. Streetlights illuminated quiet sidewalks where children rode bicycles and parents walked dogs without the hypervigilance that had marked decades of uncertainty. Cathy's daughter tucked her own 6-year-old into bed, the same ritual that had been interrupted so violently in 1986. But this bedtime was different. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the shadow of unknown threat lurking in the darkness. "Tell me about Grandma Cathy," again, her daughter requested, as children do when they sense a story carries special meaning. "She was brave and kind. She loved music and flowers, and taking care of people. She would have loved you so much. Will someone hurt me like they hurt her?" The question every parent dreads. But now, she could answer with genuine conviction, instead of false reassurance. "No, sweetheart, that man is gone, and we have better ways to keep people safe now. You're going to be just fine." She turned on the night light, a simple turtle that projected stars on the ceiling. Her daughter's eyes grew heavy, watching the gentle patterns dance overhead. "Good night, little one," she whispered, the same words her mother had spoken on that final December evening. But this time, morning would come peacefully, Outside, Three Rivers settled into sleep without the undercurrent of fear that had marked thousands of nights since 1986. Doors that had been triple-locked for decades stood secured by simple deadbolts. Parents kissed children goodnight without the whispered prayers that had become second nature. The town slept peacefully, finally free from the shadow that had haunted it for nearly 4 decades.